Okay, so next one we've got an essay, to what extent do you agree or disagree? So we've got a nice argumentative essay. So the key for doing a to what extent do you agree or disagree is that you don't need to follow the pattern of some people think A, well some people think B, my opinion is whatever. So you want to be telling me your opinion strongly in your introduction, and you want to be using your body 1 and body 2 as your 2 supporting reasons to explain why you agree or you disagree. Also, the to what extent also allows you to expand and explain on your answer for those higher level candidates going for the higher marks. To what extent means that there's area, in the gray between agree and disagree. You can use that to create a more sophisticated argument. So you can do a, if this happens, then I agree. Or in terms of A, then I agree with this, but in terms of B, I don't agree with it. Okay, so there's room for you to give some nuance. You can also do the structure of your introduction. You can do sort of, I would agree with it in terms of A paragraph, and then I would not agree with it in terms of B paragraph. Okay, so the example I always give to students is about nuclear power. So to what extent do you agree or disagree? You can say, well, I do agree that nuclear power is cheap and is better for the environment than fossil fuels, and therefore if governments can regulate them strongly and keep people safe, then I agree that nuclear power is a good source of fuel. Okay, so it's to what extent. You're saying, okay, I do agree, but with these caveats. And that's how you can get to that more sophisticated, higher level task achievement, and you can show some more sophisticated grammar when doing your arguments. So this topic is one we've seen before. When a country develops its technology, traditional skills and ways of life die out. Is it pointless to try and keep them alive? It is pointless to try and keep them alive. To what extent do you agree or disagree with this opinion? Okay, so you want to be talking about the conflict between new technology and traditional skills and ways of life. I think this is something quite particular to Asia, I think, because when I think about the UK and I'm trying to think about British traditional skills and ways of life, I think they're already gone. Whatever they were, they died in the generation before me. I'm thinking about, okay, I guess what in terms of farming, that we don't really have that. We don't have traditional holidays so much like Asian countries tend to have. Traditional skills, I'm struggling to think what traditional skills we would have in the UK. So I think this is a topic particularly relevant to Asia, where in Asian countries we still have such a strong traditional culture. And honestly, I think that's something we don't have so strongly in the UK. So personally, I would struggle to write this essay topic specifically about my country, because I feel like our traditional cultures and skills have already died out. So let's see what positions this candidate has taken on it. So let's look at their introduction. When a new outstanding technology is developed, this sometimes changes the lifestyle in a country. As a result, the traditional skills and ways of life may disappear. I will extend why we should try to keep them alive. I think this kind of was trying to say, I will explain why we should try to keep them alive. Okay, so first point, I realized I will explain why we should try to keep them alive. Why do I like this? It's a very clear opinion. I like that they've told me where they stand in the debate, and so the rest of the essay is going to be explaining to me why they believe what they believe. The only thing that could be improved is, I always say this, including subtopics, so giving me a hint about what you're going to be talking about. So you could say, I will explain why we should keep them alive due to their inherent cultural value and connection to country's historical record, or something like that. Then I know, oh, what are you going to talk about? You're going to talk about the inherent cultural value and link to the historical record. Okay. Now, stuff I like less. When a new outstanding technology is developed. Outstanding here in this sentence sounds unnatural and strange. You shouldn't be saying unnatural. When a new, I would say when new innovative is a word that we often use to describe technology, not really outstanding. It's very strange for me to say outstanding technology. It's not a combination of words that we use naturally in English. So innovative is a word that's often strongly linked to technology. So when new innovative technology is developed, this sometimes changes the lifestyle in a country. As a result, the traditional skills and ways of life may disappear. Okay, the only thing they could have done maybe was sort of paraphrase traditional skills and ways of life. The traditional skills and ways of traditional skills I've said this before on previous essays, it's a difficult term to paraphrase because there are not that many different ways to say it. You could say traditional crafts instead of skills, traditional knowledge, something like that. But I'm not sort of going to pick this candidate too hard on that. So we've got reasonably good introduction. We've got some background information sentence. We've just, a sort of background information sentence. We've got a sentence which sort of sets up the topic, and then we've got a sentence that gives me their opinion. Okay, that's your pretty solid introduction. All right, so let's have a look at paragraph 1. First, when the society has changed suddenly, it always brings some trouble, such as the conflict between generations. So this doesn't need that. First, when society has changed suddenly, it always brings some trouble, such as the conflict between generations. Okay, I think I've got an issue here with this candidate's tense. Because we've got has changed, so we're talking about the past, and always brings, which is present. So we say, when society changes suddenly, would be okay. Or first, so you would use has changed if you're giving a specific example. So first, in the past, when society has changed suddenly, it always brought some trouble. Okay, so that would sort of, the tense then would match. But I think what this candidate should do more naturally is they're talking in general. So when we talk in general, we use present. First, when society changes suddenly, it always, there should be a comma, it always brings some trouble, such as conflict between generations, okay? The old generations are not easily familiar with the new technology and don't understand why the young people act or wear differently with their ways, or wear differently, that doesn't fit. Wear, obviously, we're talking about clothes. So you could say, or maybe they're being specific, or wear different clothes. But I think it's more naturally, don't understand why young people, I would just say act differently with their ways, with their ways. Why young people act so differently, I think would be a much more natural way to say that. So when we say the old generations, it's a little bit too direct. I would say the older generations, or just older generations, are not easily familiar with new technology and don't understand why young people act so differently. Okay, in contrast, younger generations don't try to understand the old style, don't try to understand old styles, and ignore what the oldest said. Again, we've got present versus past here, and ignore what the older generation, or we could say what older people say, this should be. However, when we try to keep traditional ways of life, it will help the young generation to understand why the old generation acts, the past plural, acts that way. It will be helpful to compromise the conflict. It will help compromise in the conflict. So okay, fine. When society changes, there's conflict between the old generations. I'm not sure I agree with what this person's saying, that it doesn't feel quite logical that because of technology, we're creating this conflict. What I would have liked, I think what would make this argument stronger would be the inclusion of a specific example. So, and you can talk about experiences from your own life. So this candidate could have given a specific example of their conflict between them and their grandparents, and then how them learning some traditional culture from their grandparents helped them to get closer. So I think that's what this is missing. I feel like I'm sort of, it's quite theoretical, and it's quite general. Older generations don't like young people, so the solution is that young people should learn about traditional culture. But okay, I can kind of get it, but what I think would make this argument a lot stronger is the use of a specific example. So like I said, for example, me and my grandmother used to fight a lot when I was a teenager. because she felt I spent too much time on my phone and didn't respect her or older people like her. This was a big conflict between us, but then after I started learning traditional painting from her, we were able to spend time together and I could more easily understand her way of thinking, which reduced the conflict between us. Something like that would make this argument a little bit better. But one thing we can obviously see from this candidate is they've got issues with their determiners and they're not consistent about when to use determiners and when they're not. So I would tell the student to go away and revise that. Overall, I'm like, okay, kind of, it makes sense what this candidate is saying, but I would say it's a weak argument because it doesn't feel fully logical to me what they're saying. Moving on, secondly, traditional skills and ways of life are not pointless. Even the new technology applied, even with the application of new technology. That ways, okay, so we've got again plural, those ways were built and maintained for a long time, and it means that they are valuable because they contain countless wisdom. They contain the countless wisdom of our ancestors. These wisdom, can you spot them safe? This wisdom can help us to find an answer when we cannot solve an enormous trouble which is caused by a new technology. For example, in Korea, while industrialization, or due to industrialization, our lifestyle has changed to live individually. Our lifestyle has changed so that more people live individually and are more selfish. However, whenever we find problems such as isolation death, people are trying to educate our children more by using books which contain our ancestors' wisdom, or if it was there, it would be the wisdom of our ancestors. What is an isolation death? I'm guessing that's a direct translation of a Korean term for something. I know in Japan they have special words for things like, they have a special word for like death from overwork or things like that. Isolation death is not a concept I'm familiar with as a British person. It's not a word combination that we use. So maybe we would say such as death from isolation. But I still wouldn't be totally clear on what that was. I need a little bit further explanation. I feel like perhaps my guess would be this is a Korean word that Google sort of directly translates to isolation death. So what I think this candidate needs to do is, in this example, they need to explain what isolation death is and then link it to how people are trying to solve it. Okay? So if I'm gonna guess that isolation death probably means something like people live alone and just die because they're so lonely. I don't know if that's what it is, but if that would be my feeling of the word. So they need to explain to me what that is. So they said, for example, in Korea, due to industrialization, our lifestyle has changed so that more people live individually and are more selfish. However, this has caused serious problems such as isolation death, whereby is a good word, which is sort of saying, next I'm going to explain to you what it means. So problems such as isolation death, whereby people who live alone are not able to get the social connections that they need, become depressed, give up on life, and die from loneliness. Okay? Then in your example, you've included an explanation of a concept that is quite specific to your own culture, so that you don't know what nationality necessarily your examiner will be. So sort of a culturally specific concept like that, you do need to explain a little bit more. Then you would link to solve this problem, people are trying to educate our children more by using books which contain our ancestors' wisdom. Okay, and then again, I think this just is tell me more. Like what kind of wisdom? Because I don't really know what isolation death is, like I can't imagine what kind of wisdom is written in old books. So you could say you would need to be more specific. So if I was going to make something up, I would say, by using books such as the traditional Korean poet so and so and so, who gives us wisdom about how to live a more connected life. And then studies have shown that people who read this book tend to be less lonely, or something like that. I find that the sort of connection between reading a book with ancient wisdom and stopping people dying from loneliness, I don't quite see the connection between these two things. So I would need that to be explained to me more. So in terms of this candidate, I can see that they understand the question and they're trying to put forward an argument. And I think that this argument is quite interesting. And it's definitely a unique perspective on this topic. And it's a different argument to previous candidates I've seen who've answered the same question. I just think that the weakness of this answer is that they're not fully explaining what they mean, and they're not fully explaining their thinking from a base level upwards. So towards the end of this, in this example, they just need to be more specific and explain it for a non-specialist, non-Korean audience, who are the people who are going to be reading it. Okay, so we look at the conclusion. Consequently, maintaining traditional skills and ways will help to solve conflict or problems caused by new technologies. So we need to keep our traditions. I think this is a little bit too strong. I would say may or might or can help solve conflict, because I don't know. Well, does maintaining traditional skills and ways of life help solve problems caused by technology such as speeding or I don't know, something like that? But I think the strong point of this conclusion is that I like that they've kept their opinion clear and it's built on what they argued before. So they talked in their body 1 and body 2 about conflict between older and younger generations, and they've repeated that and summarized it in their conclusion. So in terms of task completion, I think this is a reasonably strong essay. They give me their opinion, they argue consistently throughout, and then they summarize it in their conclusion. That's actually quite strong. But like I said, my issue is slightly with the lack of explanation that makes their argument sound better for a non-Korean reader. Okay, and I think that and again, like I said, body 1, they need a more specific example of this conflict, and they need to explain more about isolation death and their ancestors' wisdom. So because I'm not Korean, I don't really understand what they mean. So if we're looking at marks, I'd say honestly for task achievement, they did answer all parts of the task. They put forward a relevant position. I would want to give a 6.0 for task achievement. Coherence and cohesion, pretty good. Like I said, consistent in what they were arguing throughout. And they have, reasonably good transitions between sentences. Basically we're pretty good. So I would want to give a 6 for cohesion and coherence. In terms of vocabulary, I think there's a sort of phrase in the mark scheme which is sort of like minimally adequate for the task. So I would say, minimally adequate for the task. I would want to put their vocabulary kind of in the sort of 5.5. I feel like they repeat themselves quite a bit in the sort of old generations, young generations, old generations, young generations kind of way. That can sort of be paraphrased more or written more with, better vocabulary in it. And then I think the weakest point, to be honest, of this essay is some of these very easy to fix grammar mistakes, especially in terms of plurals, in terms of determiners, in terms of making sure that the tenses in your sentence match. So I think, to be honest, the grammar I would probably put a sort of like more down at a 5. So I think overall this candidate is probably pulling out an overall 5.5, which is quite respectable. But I honestly think if they could just go through and fix some of these simple grammar mistakes, I was just checking through as I was reading the essay, and they explained a little bit more specifically about their ideas, this essay could easily go up to a 6 or potentially even higher. So I think this essay has a lot of potential. I really appreciated how consistent this candidate was with their argument, and I really appreciated how this is kind of a unique argument about the topic that I've not read before. And I've read quite a few essays which try to answer this question. This is the first time I've read a candidate who's argued it in quite this way, so I appreciate the creativity with which they approach the question. So I think this candidate's got a lot of potential, and I think they did a pretty good job.